people interested in finding out more about it for a long time.
Thank you so much, Jane. Last but certainly not least, Christine, if you wouldn't mind just sharing your trajectory. Christine, are you with us?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I want to say thank you to our hosts and also thank you for all the attendees. I am happy to discuss my background as it relates to my current career in environmental justice. I began my interest in environmental justice, I would say, in college, and I began my academic career in research. I was working on immunology research issues, working in a laboratory doing cell bio research. And I was particularly interested in how our immune systems help us to fight disease. I considered a career in epidemiology, and I was always thinking to myself, how can I use what I know or what I've learned from the lab to serve? And I went to the City College of New York, and I remember during that time, particularly in Harlem, there was a lot of information in the news about the asthma epidemic. And I grew up in New York, and I had many friends who also had asthma. So I was always wondering, how can I bridge my lab work with things that I was actually personally and interested in? I had the fortune to win a fellowship to work at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. It was a student research fellowship. And there I worked on a team of students and researchers that focused on asthma and the ways in which particulate matter and air quality and also different socioeconomic factors affected different populations, which was kind of some of the first practical work I was doing in environmental justice as an undergrad. And that really blossomed for me into many different areas. I could see the policy implications. I could see that there were some threads for legal advocacy and legislative advocacy. Even at that age, I think I could see that there are many opportunities to work in this area and to serve. And I found that my skill set in advocacy and also my skill set in research could serve well as an attorney. And so I, through a series of internships after my fellowship at NASA, I started to really crystallize my areas of interest in environmental health and development, especially in urban areas. So I went to Duke University School of Law, and I had the fortune to meet many other students who are very interested in environmental law and different facets of just the legal profession in general. And it was very eye-opening because I could see a lot of the interconnections between my areas of interest and others. And that really helps you to see that you can't really practice and advance environmental justice principles in an island. You really have to have a grounding in administrative law. You have to understand corporate law, corporate structure. You have to really understand tax law, local and state and local tax. Like all these areas really help you to really advance environmental justice principles and goals. And I had another great opportunity to do an environmental poverty law clinic within the poverty law clinic at Duke Law. And I started to learn about urban environmental issues. That was my area, but then rural environmental justice issues. And so I said, it's a lot broader than you realize, and usually it's based on where you're from. And from there, I decided, I'd always wanted to go into public interest and serve. And I graduated and worked at the Legal Aid Society of New York for several years. It was a really great opportunity doing direct advocacy for families who were in danger of losing their housing. But I soon realized that a lot of the environmental health and asthma and lead and indoor air quality issues that I was learning about as a student and even in law school and through my internships were very present. And while the Legal Aid Society did not do environmental law, I found myself really grappling with some of these issues in terms of how our legal system structures remedies for people who are facing environmental health and injustices. And that was clearly EJ work, but it was different in that I was primarily doing housing. So I'm mentioning that as a flag for anybody who maybe wants to do environmental justice work, like right out of law school, try to see where you can find it in the work that you are doing or wherever you get hired, because for me, it was very clear. And it helped me to really shape the way I worked later on. I guess I'll conclude mainly with what I loved about working at the Legal Aid Society was the public education component. I did a lot of community outreach, and it helped me to really get an understanding of what people want to know and how we as lawyers can best advance not only like legal objectives, but really help the community to become stronger as a result of our interactions with them, and to really guide the direction of what they want to advocate for. And this is grounded in a concept called community lawyering, which hopefully I'll get to touch on a little bit later. But as a community lawyer, I took great, I found myself in a very fortunate position to help people, to educate communities, and to really direct all the resources we had as a public law firm to, taking care of issues that, affected New Yorkers. And I would say, I guess, that I had always wanted to teach somehow. So I think my first experiences with teaching were really through these public information forums and Know Your Rights, which is really important to me. So from there, I moved on. I worked for the state of New York as a regional director for the State Division of Human Rights. And that was a real opportunity to really see how our civil rights frame remedies and how different groups are affected by the way that we interpret laws. And I will finish up with probably my last job before my teaching was I was working at the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest for several years as an environmental justice lawyer. And they're really practicing within the community lawyering model and assisting families and community groups and just educating the public and really getting immersed in legislative advocacy and different types of, I guess, advocacy strategies, which you can discuss a bit later. And from there, I moved on to teaching, which I find a great benefit for me and for the students to really impart what I know and what I've learned over the years to the next generation. Before you know it, as you're an intern right now, if you're watching as an intern, you will be a seasoned lawyer before you know it, the time flies just like that. And, we are an apprenticeship profession first and foremost, I think. So we all have some duty to impart what we know and to help the next generation to, become even stronger. And so my love for teaching, I enjoy. And right now I'm adjunct professor at 2 schools, 2 different groups of students, all very committed to different areas of climate and environmental justice. And I enjoy it very much. So my journey began, I guess, in the sciences. I'm still somewhat in the sciences, but also I've always been committed to public interest. And I'm hoping that in some small part, whatever experiences I have, I can share that help motivate somebody to come and join us, right? Come and join our work. Thank you.
For sure. I think that's a great plug for the work we all do. And I guess that segues nicely into my next question, which is actually, what do we do? How does EJ come up in our daily work? And along the same lines, what does it mean to you? Because it comes up in different ways for each of you. What does it mean to you? What does environmental justice mean to you? So Jay, I think I'll kick it to you first, and then maybe Stacy, and then Christine.
It goes back to what I guess as part of what led me into law was initially the environmental issues generally, but environmental justice, it's about the injustice. It's about the injustice, and I just saw a question related to that. My introduction, as I said, was going down to these communities around Baton Rouge and what is known as Cancer Alley, and just seeing that there was a procession of big chemical plants that were built in the African American communities, it was easier for whatever reason for companies to site facilities there. There's examples, all over the country, hazardous waste, solid waste facilities that are cited in minority communities or next to minority communities because they have had a less of a voice in being able to object to or ask for, demand the controls that should be there. But I'm coming from it as a resource person to try and let people understand what the rules require, what their rights are, how they can participate, those kinds of things. The Environmental Law Institute is a publishing, research, and education organization. We do not do any representation, whether it's lobbying or litigation, but we do provide information and resources, and it is now something that infuses what we're doing throughout the Institute, whether it's in our education programs or our publishing and our what we call our research and policy, which is the action part of the Environmental Law Institute.
Stacy, how about you? How does it come up in your work?
So I think we're all sort of highlighting how cross-cutting this issue is and how sort of necessarily cross-cutting it is. It's not just a siloed media statute or anything like that. It requires, as Christine I think said, it's such an interdisciplinary area. And what I left out from sort of my background is in undergrad, I worked for Professor Lonnie Guinier, who has a strong background in critical race theory and civil rights work. And I went to Howard, which is sort of enormous institution with a huge foundational history in civil rights. So, came to environmental work with that lens. And I think that the federal government, though it has a strong history in this space since 1994, with the executive order requiring federal agencies to consider environmental justice in their work, it's really accelerated now. And there's a very strong business case. I hate that phrase, but there's a really compelling argument for companies to say, even in the C-suite now, what is environmental justice? What does this mean for our company? And despite my personal feelings, I am an advocate and I work for my clients. And it's come to a point where there's an unavoidable conversation about what is happening at the federal level with respect to policy, with respect to enforcement, with respect to civil rights enforcement. What does this mean for your ability to get federal grants? So I think the Biden administration and several states have really doubled down on prioritizing environmental justice. So most of my work really involves, it's a couple things. You have some clients who are very much like, we already know what EJ is, but we want to incorporate it in a really meaningful way in our work across our sort of ESG efforts, but anything from specific projects to wholesale operations to how they think about philanthropy, and that's focusing on the components of fairness. So making sure that they're mitigating adverse impacts on vulnerable communities, but also ensuring that benefits are equitably distributed, and also thinking about engagement in a meaningful way, two-way engagement, making sure that communities' voices are elevated such that they're part of decision making. There's also clients I work with to help with grant applications and funding opportunities, which now have really significant EJ components, like community benefits plans, which DOE is requiring for many funding opportunities. And that sort of bakes in a commitment to embed community voices and investment and engagement, as well as measurement and tracking of impacts and benefits towards those disadvantaged communities. So that's another bucket. And then we sort of do more project-specific work or sort of impact or cross-enterprise assessments of EJ priorities. So it could be a specific permitting activity where we say, okay, here's an analysis of where you have vulnerabilities, where you might want to mitigate, where you might want to explore focused engagement, or it could be across an entire enterprise where you're looking at all facilities, all projects, and say, okay, well, here's how you might triage and prioritize your environmental justice strategies. And here are some best practices for how you might incorporate them in your work. So it's exciting, and it's a space that's changing so much, as we all know. So it continues to be dynamic, but it's great to be able to get industry players at the table and really thinking about this seriously, because as I mentioned, again, there's not a lot of concrete guidance for industry to practically incorporate that. And I think we all have to be leaning forward. All stakeholders have to be at the table, including industry, so to make any progress.
And Christine, I know you're spending a lot of your time educating on this issue. So I want to kind of modify this question for you a little bit to focus on what is EJ at its core? Like, we have these underlying statutes, we have this executive order, but as we're all saying, this is a cross-cutting issue. So how are people who are just diving into this, where can they start, or what can they look to get a good understanding of what this even is?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. And also thanks to my co-panelists for those inspiring answers. Well, environmental justice at its core is really about equity. It's about principles of fairness, how we treat one another, which I believe is really grounded in just empathy. And it's about access. Who gets access to clean air? Who gets access to green space, blue space? What kind of access do we have? The quality of that access. So if you want to really ground it on just maybe two key principles, it would be around fairness and access. As the environmental justice movement has probably come more to the forefront over the course, particularly of the Biden administration, we have growing interest. And as I explained to my students, it's important to note that the environmental justice movement has been around for decades and even predates Executive Order 12898, which I believe was one of the first strong governmental articulations of environmental justice principles and the commitments to advance such across the government. But if you look at historic struggles in urban areas and rural areas across the country, you'll see threads of the environmental justice movement that ultimately were woven together by various advocates throughout the late 80s and early 90s to really create this fabric of a movement, which we can all call the environmental justice movement. And you can look at different civil rights movement, protests. If you think about the sanitation workers who were fighting for equal treatment and equity in that fairness, access. If you look at the development of the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York and what happened, how various communities across the country had faced similar fates, where large swaths of their community were removed in order to create the infrastructure that drives our country. And you look at this and say, well, we need these things, but how do we do it fairly? How do we do it and create access and maintain opportunity for all communities? So going back to those core principles of equity and fairness and access and opportunity, you can really see that it touches everywhere. How we buy real estate, how we make our zoning laws, who can live where do we cite things? If you're interested in public health, we look as far as the COVID-19 pandemic. Who did it affect? What mechanisms were in place? How were people affected who couldn't go into work? How did they lose benefits? How does that affect community economic development? So there are many ways that you can get involved and plug in and see these strings of environmental injustices and kind of follow them and see how your particular career trajectory, your interest in the law can help to amplify and do something about some of these issues. So today we have, I think, a real opportunity, unlike we've had in decades before. The Biden administration's real push to continue and create a real whole government approach to fighting environmental injustices across the board. But you also see with the Biden administration a continued infusion of principles of equity and fairness, and using the executive order structure to really create the mechanisms we need to get these things going quickly. you'll see it in the Department of Justice. They recently released a fact sheet that's very instructive of the work that they've been doing, which was directed under the executive orders of the Biden administration, one of the earlier climate and environmental justice related orders. You'll see the work of the EPA, but then, you just look around and you just look outside. I think for me, all be on the Eastern Seaboard, but I remember about a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, I left my house and it was hazy. I smelled smoke. And I asked a law enforcement officer whom I know, I said, what's going on? And he said, there are fires burning in Alberta, Canada. And I know, I was an international studies major, so, I like geography. So I know where Alberta, Canada is, and I know where I live. And we've had some of the worst air quality over the past 2 days. This is the second day that people are really experiencing it, but the haze really started about a week ago. And it just reminds people that air quality, access to clean, fresh air, pre-existing conditions, cumulative impacts. Now imagine if you live in an environmental justice community and you're experiencing this reduction in our air quality. So I encourage people to know that you may not start off as an environmental lawyer, or you may not have an EJ background, but there's room for everybody at this table. We need everybody to look at these issues because they're affecting everybody. And now people are putting masks back on and they're all walking. And I talked to my students this past semester. We engage in some regulatory advocacy in our office, and the air quality standards were up for reconsideration. It doesn't happen often, but the EPA had to reconsider it. And at the heart of that was particulate matter 2.5. And how are we going to address this? Right. So these issues may manifest differently. It may be we were thinking about PM 2.5 from maybe a point like a source, like a factory, but now we have this wildfire and the I don't even know what to call it, the haze. So EJ is all around us. It has different manifestations. Climate justice, ocean justice now, all these issues. We need everybody. So what it means to me is a daily work. It's I think about it all the time. You ask anybody what I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about EJ. I'm going to talk about your food justice. It's all I talk about, really. I mean, I have other interests, but professionally, personally, and just as a person, just in society right now, you can't really avoid thinking about how our environment impacts our health, our collective futures, and what we can do about it. As lawyers, there's a lot that we can do. And I encourage everybody to, if it's not central to your practice, just consider it somehow.
Yeah, I could not have gotten us a better example today than if we just look outside. But, it's funny you were mentioning that. I was actually thinking about it as an occupational safety hazard for construction folks and people who do have to be outside today, and the cross-cutting issue between environmental justice concerns with the air and occupational safety. And it kind of dovetails a little into my next question for you, Stacey. For folks who are interested in private practice, and they maybe want to start to incorporate this into their practice, or like Beveridge, create a practice group centered around EJ, what tips or tricks do you have for them? Or what were some good resources that were helpful to you all when you were creating that practice group?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think the Biden administration has certainly helped, but finding those toeholds, like understanding what the legal case is, what are the existing authorities, and how do you consider environmental justice in those enforceable authorities? Because that's usually the question that you get from those who are, not necessarily true believers from the start, not like EJ geeks like us, who want to say, okay, well, you want us to spend more money, or spend time, or change our practices. Why? And I think that includes law firm colleagues. We had a lot of support at BND, but I know just broadly, it's hard to justify an area that can seem like a fad to those who don't know anything about it. And say, oh, it's going to be gone by the time, by the end of this administration. But no, then you realize that, New Jersey's environmental justice permitting law popped up in 2020 under the Trump administration. And that regardless of what's going to happen in the next 2 years, if it's not another administration that's pushing environmental justice, there will likely be a recoil at the state level, and from advocacy organizations and communities that have now been empowered so significantly. And there's an executive order, 14,000, was it 1496, 14096, huge, puts the first national definition of environmental justice in print at the federal level, and just really big foundational changes. So I think my tip would be to really get grounded in what those authorities are, so that as you come across it in your work, regardless of whether or not you're a CERCLA lawyer, a RCRA lawyer, Clean Air Act lawyer, really great, and then you can understand where, where the emergency authorities, where EPA could come in. How is CEQ thinking about this in terms of NEPA, and what are we expecting there? 404 permits and the Army Corps of Engineers, how are they incorporating environmental justice? So thinking broadly about it, and then figuring out what those legal authorities are, so that you can mention in your teams, hey, have we thought about the environmental justice implications here? What are the potential enforcement vulnerabilities for our client based on where their facilities are located? What can they do to mitigate impacts or proactively engage communities in a meaningful way to try and reduce, or understand those impacts, to direct benefits more effectively, to mitigate risk broadly for their company? So you're putting it in sort of C-suite terms, but you're ultimately also grounding yourself as a lawyer in a space that has a lot of different interdisciplinary participants to say, here's why, from a legal perspective, this is important for you as a practitioner, for your client. EJ Legal Tools are a great place to look, as well as obviously any ELI publication that speaks about this. Go check. But EJ, the legal tools that came out, the updated version, goes statute by statute through existing authorities and says, okay, well, in a perfect world, this is how we would tweak this, or how we would use this to advance environmental justice. So that's a good place to have some bedside nerd reading if you're looking to look more into this too.
Thanks so much. And so we are, with the Washington Council of Lawyers, and we're a pro bono and public interest bar association. And so Jay, I wondered if you could touch a little bit on some of the pro bono opportunities for folks who maybe don't do this in their day job, but love to get involved somehow. I know ELI has a clearinghouse. If you could talk a little about that and any other opportunities you know of.
Thank you very much, Brinka. So yes, www.eli.org/pro bono. We have the Pro Bono Clearinghouse. This is something that actually was something that ELI's board suggested, and then we had one of our volunteer attorneys, Scott Badnock, who's a very, very strong EJ lawyer, decided to basically put it together. So this is on the website. It is a place where communities can post a brief description of a matter that they need some pro bono assistance on. Attorneys can sign up. We want people to sign up because we want them to take a short 1.5 hour CLE program on community lawyering. I think Christine mentioned the community lawyering. We think that that's something that people should understand a little bit about, how to work with communities and how they might be different from other clients. We have, I think right now, 59 matters that are listed. They are a real variety. Some of them are the classic kinds of EJ matters where it's, overburden of pollution. Some of them are communities that are needing legal advice for more standard law. We've got some where people are needing tax advice, and they're needing to file documents to incorporate. So lawyers who are not environmental lawyers, have another field of practice, can get involved and really help environmental justice communities, because it's not all about the environmental law. Some of the, and the other thing about the matters is some of them are estimated to take a few hours, and some of them are going to be litigation. We don't have a lot that are litigation, but some of them may be long-term projects. The other thing is that there are opportunities for students. So I think at least a good part of the audience here is students, and Scott Badenoch, who is the founder and has taken some matters, really values having student assistance for research, to help with interviews and other things. So there are roles for students to take on as part of the clearinghouse as well. And we have had students that have been assisting attorneys in the matters. The other thing that I did want to take off on what Stacy said, for those of you who another place to learn about environmental justice is Barry Hill, widely respected environmental justice attorney, has authored the Environmental Justice Handbook, which ELI Press has published. It's in its 5th edition. I will say it's a heavyweight, but it is a comprehensive resource about environmental justice. And if you want the sort of a next version of what we're doing here, ELI has a summer school series of webinars, some in person this summer, that are oriented towards interns, law clerks, and the final one at the end of July will be focused on environmental justice. But the others each take a practice area and explain what's going on. So to the point that we've all been making, it's a way to learn about each of the subject matters. And I know EJ comes up as part of what the people are talking about.
Yeah, and the summer school is open to everyone, right? It's a free series.
It is free. It's open to everyone. We're having a couple of them be in person at our offices, and so you do have to register and get a quote account. The membership in ELI is free to students, whether undergraduate or law school or graduate school, and then you actually can get one of our publications as well.
Yeah, and having been on the receiving end of a lot of your resources, it is a really great organization for those who want to get up to speed on some of these statutes that we've been mentioning, RCRA, TSCA, all of those statutes. Each ELI course focuses on a different statute, and so you can kind of pick and choose and create your own adventure. And you also do a boot camp, which is really nice for start attorneys. If anyone's an associate and just starting out, the ELI offers boot camp in fall and spring. That was a required training for me when I started, and I'm sure is a required training for others, but as a great course as well for those who want to kind of make this part of their official practice.
3 days in intense everything you wanted to know about environmental law.
But Christine, I want to pivot to you now to focus on sort of the community advocacy piece of this beyond maybe the lawyering piece. There's, you talked about regulatory commenting, but I know there are other projects that you and your students have worked on, and I wondered if you could share more about those opportunities for folks who are interested in that side of this.
Sure. What I really enjoy about environmental justice advocacy and teaching it is that it allows people to see how they can plug in almost immediately. And the important thing is to know that you have a lot of skills and you also have a lot of experiences that really help to advance the movement, because it gives people an idea of what people are experiencing. And then as, say, a practitioner, you can use your background to help address some of these issues. So my approach to community lawyering involves really helping communities to understand how to articulate and advocate in different ways. That might be through public relations work where you help a client to write an op-ed. It might be through helping people to organize or helping to create an opportunity for legislative advocacy. And all of these things are all open to the public. There's an important public involvement component to the shaping of all of our environmental laws. And so, as I mentioned before, there was a recent comment period because the EPA was reconsidering how they're going to address particulate matter. So I encourage people to understand the regulatory process on the state, the local, and the federal level, to get involved by finding out what their local legislature may be addressing in terms of environmental justice or environmental advocacy. You can do this by helping people to draft testimony and helping them to find their voice to explain what they're experiencing, or if they're already an expert, like sometimes you might work with physicians or nurses or engineers or architects, and helping them to kind of gain an understanding of how this type of work helps to appreciates their input. And when you do participate in legislative advocacy, your statement, your comment, your testimony becomes part of a record, and that's considered when the final regs are drafted or when final laws going to be passed or any amendments. This is a very important part. So, the public relations part where you're helping people to say, get involved in media interviews or speaking with the press. And lawyers are very helpful in that because you can really help your client to understand, what you should say, what you probably shouldn't say. And then you have the regulatory part where it's just like get involved in legislative advocacy, figure out how our regulatory system really helps to advance and protect, and all these things that really matter, checking out how to use the Federal Register, all these things that are components of real-time advocacy. Notifying people public comment periods are open. So those are some of the ways. And then when it comes down to grassroots community advocacy, helping people, and people wonder, how do I plug in? How do I start? And I like to encourage people to begin where people gather, because that's not necessarily going to be an EJ organization. A lot of organizations come to EJ issues because they are united in talking about their lives. And if you understand that these issues affect where people live and how they work, or where they can access food and everything, these are issues that might require an attorney to say, this is an EJ issue. And some people really could get some assistance walking through and unpacking what that could actually mean. Some people don't even think they're within an EJ community, and your knowledge of the law, your knowledge of how Justice 40 initiative is being structured, your knowledge of how to use the various EJ-related indexes that have come out over the past maybe 5 or 6 years. All of these components really help to advance community advocacy in different ways. So my hope is that through my work, I teach students that there's a lot of new laws now that help us, new remedies, the rights that were not existing before. But in addition to that, there's a lot of hands-on things that you can do right now as a student, as a practitioner, that can really help to advance and make a real difference like today. And I'm not saying this in like the kind of the sense like you can do this, this is real. It's happened, and I've seen people feel more empowered and encouraged because of their involvement in this type of work. So I think those are some of the surveys. Look for where the people are, meet them where they are. And also, it's a matter of caution. Not everybody sees their problem as a cause. And I think that if you are, say, very committed to climate justice or environmental justice, and you approach a group of people who are dealing with a situation, seek to address and unpack the problem at its core, its root, find the legal solutions. These small battles may become part of a larger movement. Not every battle becomes a movement, but people are more likely to trust and to go along and work with you if they see that you're solutions oriented first, as opposed to like, where does this fit into maybe a larger, some larger issues. People think about what's going on in the neighborhood first. And that's where the beauty of the community lawyering really, I think, comes out for me. Seek to help and see where you can address and plug in, and then from there, see where you can advance.
Thanks so much for that. I want to turn to a question we got about the intersection between EJ and racism. The question says Black people are 75% more likely to live by hazardous waste facilities. What specific structures led to this? And you know, the Molly asked that it isn't clear to her how we got here. And so I guess if someone wants to just touch on some of the institutional ways that this has happened, and then perhaps how we're trying to undo some of those policies. Any takers?
It feels like a professor question, I'm not gonna lie.
Okay. Great. Well, if you look at the history of the United States, and if you understand the implications of race on access, on race, on ability to live where you want, to work where you want, you can see that there were actually considerable numbers of laws in place that structured how we interact as a society, and many of those were based on race. So if you look at where people live and their proximity to, say, hazardous waste facilities, you also have to look at the history of how we are able to develop our cities and states. And these are all foundations of zoning laws and planning. And where desirable land is, where undesirable land is, and how we quantify and how we value that land. And if you look at the opportunities for certain racial groups to live places and to acquire real estate, these also had racial implications. And I think today we're seeing the ramifications of redlining, which was a practice in which there was considerations for who lived where and whether or not we're going to lend to certain groups. And that led to where people lived. And they would draw maps, and the redlining comes from the actual red lines on the maps. But if you fast forward to today and you look at those patterns, and you can overlay those red line maps to hotspots, literal hotspots. We're talking about the environmental justice issue of heat exposure. There has been recent research showing that there's a direct overlap for where red line communities are and where there is less tree canopy, less tree cover, there's less access to green space, and as a result, communities living within or in close proximity to red line communities have adverse health outcomes. Then you can look at that, and you can also look at where are we going to site facilities? There was a report that said, you know, depending on the makeup of the community, you're going to get different levels of resistance. You're going to understand that some communities it's easier to place certain facilities in this place. And then when you have one facility there, it's a lot easier for another to come, and then for another to come. So you have to look at it in terms of how the history of our country, the social history of our country, the history of civil rights. And then you also have to look at the mechanics of the legal system and how we as lawyers have to really incrementally unpack and understand how some of the structures that were in place decades before even many of us were alive are still having ramifications on people today. And this takes concern, it takes compassion, it takes empathy, understanding, and getting everybody at the table and helping people to understand that we have vestiges of this in our society. We also have, it's also present currently, but we have to do something about it. And that something is going to take a real understanding of history, a real understanding of all these areas of law that I was touching on: real estate, real property, environmental law. And then you have the other components of enforcement. Even if you do live near a polluting facility, it will impact your health if the facility is not operating according to, whichever laws are in place. Then you look at enforcement. Where are the citations happening? How are the fines are they being collected? Do people feel that they have to comply if they are reprimanded? Is there going to be some kind of mechanism for recourse if I do complain? And how are different racial groups affected by this? So there's a lot. There's enforcement, there's history, there's also present day allocations, budget. If I tell people, you want to see how things are going to go to a budget hearing. And not a lot of people talk about budget hearings. They don't sound as interesting to some people, but I find them fascinating. Even on a personal level, budgeting is basically your priorities. A budget is just priority. And if you want to make sure that there's enforcement, that the sanitation system is working well, that there's money for infrastructure, if there's a sewage issue, that there's all these things go into budgeting. All these things have implications to state and local tax. All property value and how much you're going to pay the government and how much the government has to work with the community. All these things are connected. Where are people going to work? How are they going to get to work? Where are schools going to be? How many people in your community? So all these things, all these issues, they all thread together to create the environment that we live in. And yes, we're a multicultural, multiracial society. That happens to have also a lot of strong networks that can help us to understand how we got here and what we can do about current present problems. I hope that they don't reoccur again, because history is our best teacher. So for the person's question, I hope that answers it. But what we see as environmental injustices, we have to always look at history, and we have to look at how the law shaped and created some of these situations, how they're playing out today, and then what we can do with the tools that we have. And then the best thing about EJ is it's very creative. I worked on an issue of mold in people's homes when I was a younger lawyer, but there weren't actual laws that could articulate what we're talking about. And with EJ advocacy, you can actually work to create and draft some of those laws to address, pinpoint, this is what we need, this is the solution we need. So we're in solutions mode, we're in creation mode, we're in reflection mode, a lot of modes going on, but the hope is that all of these will create lasting, sustainable solutions.
Stacy, thank you for passing that one to Christine for the wonderfully articulate answer.
I was never going to be able to come close to that.
Thanks, guys. I tried.
Good question. Piggyback on something you just said, because I think it's so good for younger practitioners, just like, this is all being invented and created right now. Like, this is happening. This is the time. So the idea of getting on the ground floor of this, it requires so much creativity. And I have so many great young associates who walk into this and they're like, but where's the law? What are we supposed to look up? Like, no. That's not how this works.
Right.
Like ESG and sustainability and circular economy, these are the issues of our time. And there's such a big opening now to be creative and to really innovate here. And I think it's just really exciting opportunity. So thank you for flagging that and for the awesome background.
And Christine, I like that you touched on the legislative and regulatory pieces of this, because executive orders are great, but they can go away with the new administration. And so making sure that things are codified appropriately. Sorry, the air quality is affecting me now. Making sure things are codified appropriately so that they will last and have durability is important. And I think with a lot of big appropriations bills coming up, Farm Bill is one that, we're looking at. just looking to see where the funding is going in those bills and making sure that it's going to the appropriate places. I really appreciated that you touched on all of that in your answer. I did want to offer a question for those interested in going into government, and I guess maybe Stacy and Jay, you can answer that. What tips do you have for folks who want to do this work in government? And obviously, we've all kind of touched on that this has become kind of a political issue, even though it shouldn't be. And so are there ways that folks who want to be in government and stay in government and not necessarily be a political appointee, but rather a career person, are there ways for people to be able to do this work? And is there space for this work in sort of the longer scheme of government?
I certainly think so. I mean, it's cross-cutting, and when you're working as a lawyer with the government, I just think that there are going to be issues that come up where if you are thinking creatively and thinking about, what is the issue, that you'll be able to see ways to apply the law, work with the law to, solve some of the problems. I mean, there are constraints on government lawyers about, what you can do, but they're probably not as significant, the constraints, as you might think when you first start off. There is the space for creativity. My example, I was at the Department of the Interior. I went there because of resource issues, but I ended up spending some time working on tribal issues. And that, there's a long history of injustice related there.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think, from my vantage point is as a former political, so it's a little bit third hand here, or just by observation, but I saw a lot of colleagues in OGC at EPA who were able to move around the different law offices at EPA, to move from, doing error work to doing a detail here, working in the front office on congressional work. So there was some flexibility. I also think, it is tough because there is flexibility from what I can tell, but a lot of that depends on the leadership team that you have and how much enforcement you're getting from not enforcement, but encouragement that you're getting from the White House. So there is a little bit of that tension, particularly in this type of work. But there are areas and ways that you can, it's where knowing those legal authorities and really having yourself grounded in this work as a lens is helpful. And it's nice to be a voice in the room, regardless of your role, to just at least raise these considerations and say, have we thought about this? Have we, thought if we can incorporate this in line with the agency's mission to do X, Y, and Z? I also wouldn't rule out state governments, because I think there are some particular states where this work is unquestionably baked in and codified. So like the New Jerseys and New Yorks and Californias and even places where cities, municipalities are trying to bring this up in states that might not be prioritizing it. So I would think creatively also about government service and, different ways to approach that, particularly in states and jurisdictions that have made it very clear how they feel about environmental justice in a way that won't be so easily changed.
Thanks for that. I just want to ask if for any of our attendees, if you have any final questions, we're coming up on time, so feel free to put it in your in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'm monitoring both. But we did get another question about sort of the legislative side of this, and obviously in DC we have a lot of lawyer lobbyists, not just traditional lawyers, and so what advice do you have for folks who want to be on the lobbying side of this issue? And how much is politics going to come into play here? Where do we think we can make some traction on this on the legislative side? And Christine, you came off mute, so I'm going to hand it over to you first.
Oh, wow. I would say, first and foremost, be extremely organized in your approach to lobbying. Be very organized for the fact that, number one, as a lawyer, and depending on the nature of the organization that you're working for and the people you reach out to, there are very specific rules for lobbying. So get very familiar with that. You don't want to get tripped up on that, and you don't want your client to either. So first and foremost, lobbying requires a great deal of organization. You know, who am I talking to? When? How long can I speak to them for? All these things. So that's just, you know, getting through the door. But then get yourself immersed in the Federal Register. Learn how to navigate regulations.gov. And the City Council of New York, for example, we have Legistar, which tells you when hearings are coming up. So you're gonna have a calendar, get yourself, I'm just being extremely practical here, get yourself a calendar that flags when comments are due, when hearings are occurring, whether or not you have to be there in person, whether or not you have to, you know, if you can just send in your comments. So that's just, you know, just the foundation. When is something happening? What do they want from you? Do they want a statement? Do they want you to testify? So that's like the paper side, like what laws am I interested in? And then you can even flag alerts. So that way you can get to know the council, like there's a committee, get to know the counselors for the committee so that they would notify you if something that's within, say, your area of interest comes up, so that you'll be called to testify or that you'll notify your clients. So those are some of like the mechanics, right? Then you have the decision of whether or not I'm going to be like an in-person lobbyist. This is a whole another level of, wow, this is really lobbying. Like, I'm going to go out to people and talk to them. Who? And who are your local electeds? You know, get a list of, you know, who's representing you in Congress. Know what committees they're on. Know how some of these committees may not exactly say EJ issue, but there may be a way that you can introduce and discuss some EJ related issues with these people. And they're interested in new ideas, they're interested in helping. And so just identifying what your interests are, flagging that to their staff, because people often, you know, think, oh, I have to go directly to the council person. I have to speak directly to the congressperson. No, get to know their staff. They have a wonderful group of people supporting them in all the offices that they work from. The local office, who is the legislative director, who's the community affairs liaison. So that way your client or yourself, they know who the players are. Who do you speak to first? And these people are expert in synthesizing huge volumes of information, because I remember I interned one summer in Congress, and the number of people that just come to the door with a number of different issues, and the way that legislative directors and the aides, everyone just synthesizes all these commands and requests and interviews, and then they package them and deliver them to the decision maker. So you have to know who is there to help you. So knowing that, so get your calendar ready. What am I going to talk about? How am I going to lobby? And know the sources. Get to know where the decision makers are and who helps them, because those people are really going to be your lobbying, helping you and your lobbying team. And then the last part of it is like, how do you get from we have this idea to we have this law. And that's another area of legislative advocacy, the creative part. So the first part I was talking about was like, you know, the calls to the public, calls for comments. That's something that you want to be up on. And there's also the budget hearing part. Then the middle part is like, how do you learn how to interact with these people who are working in our government, you know, behind the scenes to make things happen. And then this last part is this creative part, where you're going to need researchers, you're going to need people with actual experience, life experience. You need those people, because it can't all be us, you know. Somebody has to actually experience what you're talking about to make sure that the law actually works. And then you need to also know, what is the opposition? Who's opposing this law and why? And just because they're opposition doesn't mean, oh, people, I don't want to listen to. Stop not listening to opposition. People need to stop doing that. You need to talk to people and to read what they're publishing about the areas that you're interested in, and find, if not commonalities, or find where you can shore up your arguments, where you can maybe better articulate why this needs a legislative solution. But everyone has some kind of interest in this. Whether they're completely disinterested, that's also a level of interest that you need to do something about as well. Or they're completely passionate about it. Sometimes you have to channel that energy to make sure, okay, let's, make sure we're all focused and what are the articulable goals that we're seeking? What do we want? What's our end goal? So jumping into legislative advocacy, I think is great because you can just, as just a regular tax-paying person walking down the street, say, you know what, there's a budget hearing today at 2. I'm gonna show up. I don't have anything prepared, but I'm just gonna talk about the fact that they need to pave my street, and legislators listen because you're gonna vote. Or you can come as a lawyer for a trade organization with an easel and documents and binders and say, I'm here for the hearing. All of those people join the record. All of those statements go into the record. And all the people that I mentioned were behind the scenes. They all read that and say, well, this person is talking about this, and this person who works for the traffic controllers, interest group, they presented this. So plugging in can be on just as a person, regular, or as a professional attorney or as a community member, but there's some place for everyone. But the key thing is you have to be informed and you have to be very organized, because you don't want to come there looking like, Stacey, just giving Stacey's.
Don't be that person.
Basically, don't be that person.
No lawyer.
Right,
But it's,
so-
I mean, it's such a good point to underscore, because there's so many more opportunities now, not just on the Hill, but just agencies are having a lot more opportunities to comment and to inform processes. But because this area is so complicated and cross-cutting and solutions oriented, there's some really complicated things to sort of unpack here. And to think about, how do you effectively incorporate community input? How do you effectively mitigate certain climate strategies and solutions? That's a huge thing here. The administration trying to balance climate imperatives and goals and technologies with environmental justice impacts and considerations. So I work with a lot of industry organizations that are trying to say, well, we understand that you've got this strategy and that strategy and this strategy, and you want to require environmental justice in this way, but we think maybe since we know the technical aspects, maybe we could tweak it this way, we could tweak it that way. So it's also thinking about some of those opportunities to comment and advocate for solutions that, agencies on the agency level, where the agencies might be really overwhelmed and that might not have the bandwidth, where you can also weigh in a little bit less on an advocacy and lobbying side, but also to provide some of that knowledge and expertise and creativity and innovation that we're talking about too. So less of a lobbying piece there, but an engagement piece as well.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't see any other questions, but I'll give folks another couple minutes here to drop them in. And I did want to offer you guys an opportunity if you had any parting words. So Jay, since you're off mute, I'll turn to you first.
Well, this discussion reminded me that yet another one of the resources that ELI has is a pretty short book. I think it's The Art of Commenting, but it goes through and explains the mechanics that Christine was talking about, various things, but how to be effective in commenting on rules or projects or whatever. And it is a short one that we've published, and so the website has ELI Press, which is the books, as well as the get involved, come to the seminars, all of those kinds of things. Thank you.
Stacey, any parting words of wisdom?
Just gratitude to the organization for putting together this panel, for setting this up as what will hopefully be an ongoing conversation, and an encouragement to those who are attending to, was it the New York subway sign that says, if you see something, say something, but really just to be thinking about EJ in everything that you do. Set a Google alert for environmental justice and see how many times it pops up. Just sort of absorb it as a lens to the work that you do as you start your careers. It's such an exciting time to get involved. So thank you.
Christine?
And thank you. I'll also start from a place of gratitude. Thank you for your interest in this topic, and know that like these are exciting times, and feel welcomed, because there's room for everybody who's interested in this work to really make meaningful contributions to it. And I also want to say to the interns, I want to wish everybody like a really wonderful and productive summer. I found that my internships were really a way to build my career interests, and to really take a leadership step on a project, delve deep into something. But these are the most exciting times. So continue the work that you're doing, attending programs like this. Thank you for our hosts for putting it together, and really enrich your summer with your interests, and do the best work you can, and know that like this is I think back to my summers, and know these are really formative times. So continue the great work. If you want to contact me, I'm available. I love to mentor and teach, so that's what I do. Want to talk about EJ? We can talk about EJ all the time. So feel free to reach out if you need anything or have any questions.
Well, thank you all so much. As we mentioned, this was our first time incorporating this panel into our summer forum. And I hope that attendees walk away with some valuable perspectives. And like you said, Stacy, this is certainly not the last time we're going to be touching on this subject. So I'll hand it back to you, Christina.